Hi, this is Bill from Tenkara Colors, and we're here today to talk about choosing a Tenkara rod. And whether it's your first time or whether it's your fifth or 20th time, it's the same process. How you go about deciding what rod is going to work best for the kind of fishing you do. For one thing, choosing a rod, you have lots of choices. More than conventional fly fishing, I think I've got a bigger quiver because the rods are so uniquely different in their different lengths and flexes and so on, and different applications. So we have to start somewhere. Where you start your choice of a rod is determining what kind of water you fish, how you fish, what you are targeting. Do you fish big water? Do you fish little streams, big rivers? Do you fish rocky currents? Do you fish slow, or all of those things? Do you fish for trout, big trout, little trout, steelhead, a bass, whatever? All those things will affect your choice of rod or the ideal rod. Choosing a rod, you also want to think about how easy it is to pack. If you go backpacking, if you want to travel and pack it away, if you just want to keep one in your car, and whether that's important to you or not. And of course, the other consideration is always the price versus value, what you're willing to pay for what you get. And there is a wide range. I have rods that I bought for much less than $50 and rods that I bought for 10 times that amount. And to tell you the truth, I have a hard time figuring out if I can really justify spending that much money on a rod, but it's my favorite rod, so there you are. If you're shopping for Tenkara rods, you're going to find perhaps four different categories. There's names for rods. There's Tenkara, which is a general term. We use that to apply to almost any kind of fixed line fishing. But in Japan, there are also rods that are designed for what they call seiryu fishing, for keiryu fishing, and for honryu fishing. And we'll go into each of those four types of rods in a moment. But Tenkara is the general term that will apply to that style of fixed line fishing. All of the rods that we call Tenkara rods collapse. They're made of individual sections that nest together that can be extended or collapsed. Tenkara flex is measured as a ratio, the stiffest being 8 to 2, and the softest, which you'll find in some rods, is 4 to 6. Most rods are in the 7.3, 6.4, especially Tenkara rods. You may find that you prefer a specific flex characteristic over another. You may also find that depending on how you're fishing, some flex characteristics are better than others. But that's part of what you're going to discover as you become a better and better fisherman. You just have to be part of this, don't you? Yes, you do. Some rods are also zoom rods. In other words, you can fish it at one length, extend it, and fish it another length, sometimes a third length, even a fourth length. A zoom rod is a bit of a compromise in terms of its flex characteristics, perhaps, but it's a lot less expensive than buying 3 or 4 separate rods to cover a wide range of situations. That's what I started with. That's what I first fished with zoom rod, just because I knew I was going to be fishing in a lot of different environments. And the one thing that all of these rods we call Tenkara rods share is a principle that the cast is supposed to present the fly first to the water before the line hits the water, and the line itself is light enough that you can hold it off the water while you're pursuing your drift. And the idea is that you're not going to scare as many fish, you're not going to alarm them or indicate where you are, and you can also control the drift much longer if you basically only have the fly and maybe a little bit of leader on the water itself. This for me is the primary reason for fishing Tenkara style, that control of the flies, control of the line. The four rod styles that we're going to talk about, Tenkara, seiryu, keiryu, and honryu, each have their own characteristics. We're going to start talking about that specific Tenkara style rod. Tenkara fishing was developed first over hundreds of years in the mountain streams in Japan in little valleys. Sometimes different styles of Tenkara in different valleys as the local fishermen find out what worked best for them and passed along knowledge and so on. But the basic Tenkara rod is right now in the marketplace is probably 12 feet. Typical flex is 6.4. That's that moderately slow, fast, slow, right in between. I'd say it's a very moderate flex characteristic. You use line lengths where the total line, including the tippet, about 3 feet of tippet, is perhaps a bit longer than the rod, but not much. It helps you control the fly, control the drift, land fish in fast water. For those traditional Japanese fishermen fishing in really high gradient, swift water, rocks and pools and short drifts, and fish that have to feed opportunistically. They don't see big hatches. They have to eat whatever comes along. You use soft tackle wet flies, sometimes a floating fly. Those soft tackle wet flies, depending on their tide, sometimes also fish on the surface. But basically, you're fishing in the very top of the water column, top 6 inches or so, to fish in that Tenkara style. And that's what those rods are designed for, is to make that kind of cast, fly first, moderate length of line, and to manipulate, keep the fly in that top. And there's not dead drift necessarily. Sometimes you try all things. Sometimes there's a little pulse, which can be a deadly technique. The second type of rod is Seriu, and it's also a mountain stream rod meant to fish some of the same water that Tenkara fishes, but typically where you've got a slower, flatter, where you have to make a more delicate presentation and want to keep a little further away from the fish perhaps. Seriu was developed for that. Longer rods, 13, 14, 15 feet, uh, capable of using very light lines, but of also fishing even say a beadhead nymph. I really like the flex characteristics. These are soft, 5.5 or even 4.6 in flex characteristic. The spring creeks and that kind of fishing, that would be my setup for a spring creek with Tenkara gear, is Seriu. Seriu describes tributary water, lower down, lower than the headwaters types of fishing, still mountain streams, still moving pretty quickly, but broader water, longer casts. Still boulders and structure in the water that you can use, but you've got more intervening streams. So, not surprisingly, Seriu rods are somewhat longer. And because of those characteristics where you want control of your fly, Seriu rods are also stiffer, 7.3, even 8.2. So they're meant to have a stiff butt and a fairly sensitive tip, which is ideal for Euro-style nymphing. The fourth type of rod is called Hanryu, and it's a reference to the main stem of a river. When it gets down to lower elevations, moving slower, there's some very deep parts, very little that's shallow, very little in the way of surface obstructions or easy structure to fish around. They're also meant to handle bigger fish. So lots of times a Hanryu setup is not a super long rod, but with a very long line, fishing up to 20 or 25 feet. And with weight, they're meant to cast weight, more than even a Seriu rod is. So that's, as I said, there are a lot of variations in Tenkara style rods, fixed line rods, in terms of their flex and so on. Most now are designed to cast level lines, which is monofilament fluorocarbon or nylon. And the Japanese gauges run from 2 on the very lightest side up to about 4 on the heavier side. Starting off, you probably want to use 3.5. Traditionally, the old style lines, the old style rods, old style lines were furled lines, twisted horsehair, or now monofilament of one sort or another, that are heavier, but offer some advantages, particularly for learners. The furled lines are a lot easier to see, so that you can really see if your cast is unrolling the way it should. You can really track it better as you control the drift. But furled lines are also an option to use in windy conditions to make your cast, although you may have other problems with the wind blowing the line once it's on the water. Rods often come with tip ratings, which is a way to protect the rod itself when you get a big fish or a snag or whatever. And most Tenkara style rods, the tip rating is 5x, and that's what I carry, 5x and 6x. As a summary, I would suggest for anybody getting their first rod to get a Tenkara rod, 12 foot probably, 6.4 flex, set it up with about a little bit more than the line's length of line, including tippet, 3 feet of tippet. So a 12-foot rod, you may have a 10 feet of line plus 3 feet of tippet. Start off with furled line to get comfortable with your casting and to see how the cast responds to your rod. And then have a spool of level line that you can use and gradually use that more and more as you practice your casting and as you fish. And I think particularly when fishing, that level line is a big advantage in terms of keeping the sag out of your line and keeping a direct connection to the fly. One thing you might want to consider when buying that first rod is to consider a zoom rod. Zoom rods will extend in length from whatever the basic length is, 10 feet, 11.5 feet to 13 feet, for example. That's one. Ice Wing, I think, by Dragontail has that kind of characteristic. That covers a lot of water, covers a lot of ground, and for not much more than the price of one good rod, you can have the functionality of 3 rods, more or less. They may not cast quite as well as a single length rod, but in my experience, they're quite good. I started with a zoom rod. At least I have several now because I find them so useful when I'm going on water that changes a lot or that I don't know so well. And I've got all the bases covered. I would also recommend when buying any rod, first rod or any rod you ever buy, is to purchase the spare tip if it's offered. Some rods come with a spare tip. Other times you're going to have to contact the manufacturer to make sure you can get a spare tip. Usually that's not a big problem. And it can save a fishing trip if you've got your spare tip with you in the occasional event of breaking a tip section. They're very fine, very thin, they're easily broken, especially when you're not really paying attention to it. Like the time that I've typically broken tips is when I'm doing something with a lily and then putting pressure on that last little section of the tip itself. Anytime you're manipulating the lily, try to keep the rod entirely inside the rest of the rod, nested all the way in so that only the lily itself is outside of that. As you get comfortable with tenkara fishing and casting and want to extend your fishing to other waters or just feel different rods, I highly recommend downloading the RFI chart, which is available on Tenkara Anglers or Teton Tenkara websites. RFI is the Rod Flexibility Index. We've talked about that 6.4, 5.5, or 8.2 or whatever. This breaks down for almost all the better rods out there, breaks down what those characteristics are, what the flex index is, what the pennies, what the stiffness is of that rod. You can use it, especially once you have a rod, and you can find it on here and find out what the flex characteristics are. You can use that as a guide to another rod you want that has similar or different characteristics, either one. Anyway, I think it's a really valuable tool. And the thing I tell any fisherman beginning or been fishing for a while or whatever, even old timers, practice really does make perfect. And you've got to, the more you spend time practicing, the better your fishing is going to be. Now, practice can be in your driveway, especially with tenkara, in a park. It can also be while you're actually fishing. If you use that time to think about the cast itself, not just the fish, but use that as a way to really get feedback on how your fishing is going, what your technique is. The other thing I recommend in terms of practice mentality is to practice often, but practice short. Work on one thing at a time. I find 5 minutes or 10 minutes of practice is much better than 15 minutes or half an hour. I don't develop bad habits. I can really think about, be conscious of what my muscles are doing and how the cast is going, and try making different kinds of corrections if something's not working right, but don't overdo it. Of course, that's what I say, moderation in all things, including moderation. That includes casting practice. One of the things I like best about tenkara is that, in my experience, there are no rules. There's learning, there's tradition, there's history, there's all that stuff that can help us think about what this fishing means. But for myself, I think we're still finding ways to develop and adapt it to use the things we do know to apply to this and so on. We are all learning all the time. That's what I love about fishing generally, fly fishing in particular, and tenkara fishing even more. A lot to learn. But we're all sharing this. We're all in this together. And we share knowledge and get ahead and keep each other kind of active and engaged and having fun. But part of that is that I really would like feedback from you on what you like about this video, what you think could be different, ideas for other videos that we can do, or other discussions that we can have about tenkara fishing. Please send those to me. I'd love to see what they are, and I'd love to act on them too. So anyway, until we do another video or look back on one of our older videos, this is Bill from Tenkara Colors saying thanks and go fishing.